Story 1. Lockpicker. When I was a kid, my family lived in a house at the edge of a small town, surrounded by woods. It was an old place, 2 stories tall, and sat at the end of a long gravel driveway that wound through rows and rows of trees. By the time I was in high school, my parents were working opposite shifts, my dad during the day and my mom at night, so I was often home alone at times, especially during the evenings. One particular Friday night in late October, my mom had left for her overnight shift around 7 p.m., as usual, and after saying goodbye, I settled into my usual Friday night routine of watching movies and playing video games. My dad was out of town for a few days, visiting his brother, so I had the house to myself. It was just after 10 p.m., and I was deep into a horror movie marathon, the perfect way to spend a chilly autumn night. By 11:30, the house was quiet, except for the low hum of the TV. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the old windows and causing the trees to groan under its force. I was tired, but the creepy movies had me wired enough to stay up a little longer. The old house had a way of making even the most mundane creaks sound sinister, but after living there for so many years, I was used to it. At around midnight, I decided to finally call it a night. I shut off the TV and lights downstairs, grabbed a glass of water from the kitchen, and headed upstairs to my room. My room was at the far end of the second floor, with a window that looked out into the backyard, where the trees formed a thick wall of darkness. I spent the next hour scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the unsettling feeling that often comes after watching too many scary movies. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep. Sometime later, I was abruptly awakened by a strange noise. It was faint at first, but it was enough to jolt me from my sleep. I lay still, listening intently. I could hear a faint scraping sound coming from downstairs. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. It was 2:15 in the morning. My mom wouldn't be home for a couple more hours, so I figured it was just the wind moving branches against the house or something. But then I heard it again, this time clearer. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like something metal dragging against the hardwood floor downstairs. Instantly, a feeling of dread came over me. As I lay there, I heard it once more, louder now and more distinct. It was coming from the living room. I slowly sat up, straining to hear. As I did so, the scraping stopped altogether. I waited in the silence, heart pounding in my chest. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just my overactive mind playing tricks on me after a night of watching horror movies. But then, just as I started to relax, I heard something far worse. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps, slowly crossing the living room. My eyes widened, and my mind raced through possibilities. Could my mom have come home early? Maybe she didn't tell me, but I knew that was unlikely. Her shift never ended early, and she usually made a beeline for bed when she got home, not wandering around the house. Besides, these footsteps weren't light like hers. These were slower, heavier, almost as if someone was trying to be quiet but wasn't quite managing it. I sat up in bed, and my hands began to tremble as I reached for my phone. I stared at the screen, debating whether I should call my mom or the police. The footsteps stopped suddenly, but that only made it worse. After a long moment of nothing, I gathered the courage to swing my legs over the side of the bed and quietly tiptoe to my bedroom door. I opened it as quietly as I could, peeking out into the dark hallway. Everything was still. The house was old, with wooden floors that creaked with the slightest pressure, so I knew I had to be careful. I stepped out into the hallway, listening intently, but I heard nothing. I made my way slowly to the top of the stairs, kneeling down to peer through the railing. The downstairs was covered in darkness, and the living room was completely still. But something felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood up, clutching my phone tightly, and quietly descended the stairs. Each step felt like an eternity. When I reached the bottom, I cautiously stepped into the living room. It looked exactly as I had left it, except for one small detail. The front door was slightly ajar. I knew for a fact I had locked it before going to bed. My heart pounded with fear as I approached the door. The wind was blowing through the small gap, making the door sway slightly. As I reached out to push it closed, something caught my eye. A dark figure standing just beyond the threshold, barely visible in the shadows of the porch. I froze. The figure didn't move. I couldn't make out any features, but I could feel his gaze locked on me. I was shaking uncontrollably, and as I locked the door, I took a step back, slowly making my way back toward the stairs. Without warning, the figure stepped forward into the dim light of the porch. I could see now that it was a man, dressed in dark, heavy clothes, a hood pulled low over his face. He stood just outside the window, unmoving, staring at me. I bolted up the stairs, 2 steps at a time, slamming my bedroom door shut and locking it behind me. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. I whispered to the operator, telling her what had happened, barely able to keep my voice steady. She assured me that officers were on their way, but it felt like an eternity. Within about 25 minutes, flashing blue lights filled the driveway. The officers searched the surrounding property but found nothing. The front door had no signs of forced entry and no clues as to who the man was. I racked my brain, trying to remember if I had locked the door before going to bed. Had I misremembered, too caught up in my horror movie marathon? Or was this guy some kind of master lockpicker? Either way, it was unsettling to know he had gotten in so easily. We never found out who that man was, but every fall, when the wind picks up and the nights grow longer, I remember that night, and the fear that gripped me. Story 2, Bang. When I was about 17, I had just started my senior year of high school. To make some extra money, I'd taken up babysitting for a few families in my town. It was October, right in the middle of fall, when one of my regulars, the Bensons, asked if I could watch their daughter for the evening. Their daughter, Emily, was 6 years old and an energetic kid, but she usually went to bed easily enough. That night, Mr. and Mrs. Benson were headed to a company dinner and told me they'd be back around midnight. I arrived at their house just as the sun was starting to set. The Bensons left around 6 p.m., and Emily was thrilled to have me over. We spent the next couple of hours playing board games and eating the pizza they had left us. The night was going smoothly, with Emily showing me her new Halloween costume, a little witch outfit complete with a pointy hat. Around 8:30, I told her it was time to start getting ready for bed. Emily protested a little but eventually agreed, and we headed upstairs to her room. Her bedroom was decorated with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling and pumpkin-shaped string lights hanging along the wall. I helped her brush her teeth and get into her pajamas. She still had a lot of energy, but I managed to get her settled into bed. After reading her a short bedtime story, she finally began to drift off. I quietly left her room, turning off the lights and closing the door softly behind me. I started heading back downstairs to tidy up a bit, but as I reached the bottom of the staircase, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the front porch. I checked the window near the front door, but didn't see anything unusual. The tapping stopped, so I brushed it off and continued cleaning up. About 20 minutes later, just as I was putting away the last of the dishes, I heard the tapping again. This time it was louder. I felt a chill run down my spine. I walked to the front door and cautiously peeked through the peephole, but the porch light was dim, and I couldn't see much beyond the front steps. My heart started to race a little, but I reminded myself that it was probably nothing. Maybe a neighborhood kid playing a prank or something. I stepped back from the door, telling myself not to overthink it, and turned to head back toward the living room. That's when I heard it, a loud thud, like something banging up against the side of the house. I froze. Additional thuds followed, and seemed to move from the front porch toward the side of the house, closer to the living room windows. The blinds were half closed, leaving just enough space for me to peek through without being noticed. I knelt down next to the couch, slowly lifting the edge of the blinds to look outside. I could barely make out the figure of someone standing by the side of the house, near the fence. My stomach dropped. I watched as the figure made a fist and slammed the side of it into the house. I didn't know what to do. I contemplated calling the police, but part of me still hoped it was just a harmless kid, maybe someone cutting through the yard. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I kept my eyes glued on the figure as I fumbled for my phone. Another hard bang. I'd had enough. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. I whispered to the operator that someone was banging on the house, and it was terrifying me. They asked me for the address, and I gave it as quietly and calmly as I could. The operator assured me that officers were on their way and told me to stay on the line. Just then, the figure slowly turned and looked directly in my direction, as if it had suddenly sensed me watching from behind the window. I sprinted up the stairs, trying not to make too much noise, and burst into Emily's room. She was still asleep, her small figure curled up under her blankets, completely unaware of the danger. I scooped her up, blanket and all, and carried her to the closet in the hallway. I gently set her down inside, whispering to her to stay quiet. She woke up groggily, confused, but she could tell from my face that something was wrong. I told her to stay in the closet until I came back for her, and she nodded, eyes wide with fear. At the time, I thought the figure might try to enter the house. I clutched my phone, trying to control my shaking hands. I didn't know what I would do if they decided to break in. After what felt like an eternity, the glow of headlights finally illuminated the windows of the house, cutting through the darkness. The officers searched the property but found no trace of the figure. The Bensons came home shortly after I called them, grateful that Emily was safe. I stayed for a while longer, calming down and making sure Emily was okay before I finally left. That night stayed with me for a long time. Even though I babysat again after that, I always made sure to double-check every lock in the house before the parents left. It was a frightening night, one that I'll never forget. Story 3. The Secluded Lake. Ever since I was a kid, I've always enjoyed fishing. It's not something that many people get excited about, but growing up near a large, secluded lake made it easy to get into. My parents weren't big into outdoor activities, but I used to go down to the water whenever I could, trying to catch as many fish as I could. As I got older, I'd drive out to more remote spots, always on the lookout for new places where I could cast my line in peace. Now that I'm 28, I still go fishing whenever I can, especially in the fall. There's something about the cooler air and the way the leaves reflect off the surface of the lake that makes it feel almost magical. I usually fish alone. It's my way to relax and clear my head. Like any experienced outdoorsman, I always bring a knife with me, just in case I encounter a wild animal or get tangled in fishing line. But honestly, I've never needed it. That changed last year. It was late October, and the days were getting shorter. This particular Sunday had been long and stressful, so I decided that a quiet evening of fishing at a spot I'd recently discovered would be the perfect way to unwind. The lake was about a 45-minute drive from my house, tucked deep in a forest preserve. I hadn't fished there much, but it had quickly become one of my favorite places because of how isolated it was. There were no campgrounds, no docks, and no other fishermen. Just me, the trees, and the water. I left my house around 4 p.m., thinking I'd have enough daylight to fish for a few hours before heading home. I didn't account for how quickly it would get dark, or how heavy the overcast sky would make it feel like the sun was setting even faster. I figured I'd stay a little longer than usual and finish up as the sun made its way down. When I arrived, I set up my rod and cast my line out into the calm water. The crisp autumn air felt refreshing. I fished for about an hour without much luck, but I didn't mind. It wasn't about catching anything that day. I just wanted the peace. As the evening wore on, the forest around me began to change. The daylight was fading fast, and the thick clouds above blotted out what little light was left. I realized it was probably time to pack up and head back, but just as I reeled in my line, something tugged hard. It was a good catch, maybe the biggest fish I'd hooked in a while. Excitement replaced my earlier sense of calm, and I found myself struggling to reel it in. The battle went on for a good 10 minutes, but when I finally pulled the fish close enough to the shore, it made one last thrash, snapping the line and disappearing into the murky water. I cursed under my breath and looked around. By now, it was almost completely dark, and the air had a sudden chill that made my breath visible. I grabbed my flashlight and decided I'd head back to the car, but when I turned it on, the beam was weak. I hadn't replaced the batteries, and it was barely strong enough to cut through the thickening darkness. Something about the silence felt off now. I'd been alone here plenty of times before, but this time, it felt different. I tried to brush off the unsettling feeling and started walking up the narrow path that led back to the parking lot. As I walked, I noticed a light flickering through the trees up ahead. It wasn't a flashlight, and it wasn't fire. It was a small, pale light, like an old lantern. It was weird. I stopped, squinting to make out what it was, but just as quickly as I spotted it, it vanished. I stood still, my heart beating faster than it should have been, and scanned the woods around me. The path was narrow and surrounded by thick trees, and the darkness made everything seem even closer than it was. A few minutes later, I reached the spot where I had seen the light. My flashlight flickered out for a second, plunging me into total darkness before coming back on. When it did, I realized where the light had come from. A wooden shack, half hidden by overgrown vines, standing just off the trail. I'd noticed the shack before, though I'd never given it any thought. Curiosity got the better of me. I took a step closer, shining my light through the crack in the front door. Inside, the space was empty, except for what looked like old fishing gear, nets, rusty hooks, and a few glass jars filled with some kind of liquid. I felt a chill run down my spine, and just as I was about to back away, I heard it. A loud snap, like something had stepped on a twig. I froze. At first, there was only silence. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure, tall and thin, emerged from the shadows behind the shack. It was a man, wearing a tattered jacket. In his hand, he held something long and metallic. I didn't think. I turned and bolted down the path, sprinting as fast as I could. I glanced back just once, and the figure was moving. At the time, I wasn't sure if he was coming after me or not, but I didn't want to find out. My mind raced. My car wasn't far, but it felt like the path stretched on forever. When I finally saw the small clearing where I'd parked, relief surged through me. I threw myself inside and slammed the door, locking it behind me. As I started the engine and began to turn the car around, I could have sworn I saw the figure standing just inside the tree line, lurking just beyond the reach of my headlights. I don't know who I saw that night. I haven't been back to that lake since, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. It's a nice little spot, but one I never want to be caught in after dark again. It's just not worth the risk of being out in the middle of nowhere and realizing I'm not alone.